in locked away in the basement in a strictly controlled environment where the temperature and humidity is kept at a certain level, and they're put on these tall shelves where regular people cannot easily access. So these are some of our common impressions about rare books. But throughout this talk, a question that I would like us to keep in mind is that what makes rare books, or what makes books rare? And as you can probably tell from the quotation marks, today we're talking about how these rare books were not, in fact, that rare in the Tokugawa period. So throughout the talk today, we will go through a bit of information on education and literacy in the Tokugawa period, production and circulation of books. I will introduce some popular genres of books at the time, and in the end, I would like to talk very briefly about the relationship between rare books and material culture. So the term Japanese rare books actually refers to a very wide range of materials. We have these ones with image and text that are more often seen in museums that can date back to the 11th century, or painting scrolls sometimes with textual description. Occasionally, we have older materials such as from the 10th century or the 8th century, Buddhist sutra, or even these bamboo sheets that's mostly used for archaeological studies. But today we are mainly focusing on books from the Tokugawa period, which mainly refers to the time period between 1600 and 1868. So the Tokugawa period is also commonly referred to as the Edo period because its capital was in Edo City, which is roughly where modern-day Tokyo is now. It was also called the it is sometimes still referred to as the floating world, or ukiyo, because of the prosperous urban culture in its especially around the Edo area. The Tokugawa period, or the Tokugawa Bakufu, as we see in popular media, sometimes as the shogunate, the Tokugawa Bakufu was established after a very long period of wars between warlords, which lasted almost 2 centuries. And eventually, around 1600, the first shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Tokugawa regime. So the Tokugawa period has these features such as samurai and geisha that we kind of see very often in popular media nowadays. If you're a Japanese learner and happen to be interested in anime, you might have seen some of these works, or now we even see representations of the Tokugawa period in Hollywood movies and TV shows, which is interesting, although they're not always accurate. So one of the most important features of the Tokugawa period is the 4-class system, which is a social hierarchy that was based on Confucian values, influenced by the Chinese social system. So according to this system, in the top, we have aristocrats or samurai, who were supposed to be the ruling class of the society. And as we will talk about later, these people, well, they weren't always the ruling class, but they were the only class that were allowed official access to public education. And one interesting thing is that in the beginning, at least in the beginning and middle Tokugawa period, they got paid by rice because the early Tokugawa period relied very heavily on rice economy to a large part, which brings us to the next class of society, farmers and peasants. They were considered very important because they produced the economic foundation for the entire society. Then we have craftsmen, who were important because they produced the tools for farmers and produced weapons for samurai. And in the bottom, we have merchants or townspeople. They were considered the least important because according to Confucian values, merchants were just selfish people who took advantage of other people to benefit themselves. So they were considered the least important. And other than these four classes, we have the rest of society who were people involved in business that dealt with unwanted things. So for example, corpses or feces, a lot of them dealt with death. And the sad thing, I guess, is they weren't really considered people according to the four class hierarchy until the late 19th century. So as the society grew, originally we had only samurai and aristocrats having access to public education, but gradually with the rise of commercialism, the rest three classes also gained more access to private education. And that's thanks to a series of social changes that happened since the mid 17th century. So as there was no more war, as society stabilized, we were able to see steady population growth, which also led to the growth of material. And also from this time, the Tokugawa Bakufu spent a lot of resources building infrastructure, which created ideal environments for traveling, for entertainment, and as we are most concerned about today, education. So Tokugawa period saw a very rapid growth of literacy and expansion of education. In these pictures, for example, what do we notice from these three images? We see that these women were actively involved in creating, in producing, and enjoying literacy. And actually, this literacy among women in Japan had a pretty long tradition. Even since the 10th and 11th century, people were already, women were already involved in creating literacy. Even though at that time, literacy was still limited to aristocrat ladies, they still produced a lot of works that we are still reading nowadays, such as the Tales of Genji. In the Tokugawa period, we also see the expansion of education for children. Especially since the mid 18th century, more and more children were able to learn to read and write because of the increase of teragoya. Teragoya were children's educational institutions. In the beginning, some of them were public, but gradually merchants were able to fund the establishment of many more of them in regional areas so that local children can gather together to learn the basics of reading and writing. So in these examples show, Tokugawa period had a pretty high literacy rate. Some scholars have done studies. So Richard Rubinger actually did a study and found out that Tokugawa Japan had a literacy rate of more than 60%, which is pretty high at this time, even comparing to some European countries. And also woodblock printing techniques or xylography matured around the mid 17th century, actually mid 18th century, which created a very ideal environment for producing, enjoying, and circulating books. So because of the advancement of woodblock printing skills, a lot of the rare books that we see left from the Tokugawa period are woodblock prints. So just very quickly to introduce how it worked. Woodblock printing, as the name indicates, we have a woodblock on which carvers carve out the characters or according to the manuscript. And what we do is put ink on the woodblock, and then we press a piece of paper on the block to transfer the ink from the block to the paper. And then we get a piece of page, well, technically 2 pages usually. And if we wanted color prints, such as the kind we would see in ukiyo-e printings, we would use a set of multiple blocks. So each block would be in charge of a different part of the image. So we have a block for frame, a block probably for the background color, and other blocks for more vibrant colors in detailed parts. It's a very interesting topic, and I once tried printing a piece of pamphlet from a woodblock, and was actually extremely difficult, if anyone's interested. But because of the advancement of woodblock printing techniques, and with the rise of commercial publishing, from the end of the 18th century, we kind of see commercial publishing as a quite mature industry on its own. So the industry kind of works like this. We have popular writers who would create content based on the needs or the demands of the readers. We had prose, we had poetry, we had practical knowledge, as we will talk about later. So the writers create the manuscripts and pass them on to a publisher or a publishing house to decide whether or not for it to be published. And an interesting thing is many of the famous Japanese publishers nowadays actually have their origins back in the Tokugawa period. So for example, one of the most popular Japanese bookstore in the US, Tsutaya, actually was one of the largest printing house or publisher in Edo City in the 19th century. So if the publisher decides to publish this book, they would find calligraphers and painters to produce a sample first. This sample then gets passed on to the carvers and printers to put on a woodblock, and then through printing to put on papers and binding, and they become books that get circulated on the market. The circulation of books in the Tokugawa period is a very interesting topic because of how prosperous it was. There was a lot of circulation of books, not only in the cities, but also in rural areas, or even studies show that they even circulated in areas that we would now see as less advanced at the time, like Hokkaido or Okinawa. So there were two main ways of circulating books. One is like this picture shows, Jihondongya, which are bookstores that mainly sold illustrated books. So they mostly sold these books for entertainment, and that's kind of why they're illustrated books. So these Jihondongya were kind of like your friendly neighborhood bookstore that can order books for you, books you want, and they can collect information from you to convey to the publishers so that perhaps the writers will write something that you want to read. There were also these lending libraries by traveling booksellers called kasihonnya. So as we can observe on from the image, these are just people carrying large cases of books. They travel everywhere. They travel even sometimes between cities. They lend books to people, and then they would come back to collect them and perhaps lend you more books. They were a very, very important medium between writers and the readers, because they were able to get firsthand information from their readers who are borrowing these books about what they want to see in the books and about what the writers might be working on next. So they also they functioned not only as libraries, but also sort of as advertisement for book authors. Another fun fact, our famous Japanese Dollar Tree, Daiso, actually was one of the largest kaishihonya in Edo City in the 19th century. And I guess they gradually fell out of the business, or gave up the business to some of the people. But from these methods of circulation of books, we can kind of tell that books were a very important part of everyday life because according to studies, for example, in 1808, there were at least 656 lending libraries in Edo, and in 1817, there were at least 63 bookstores, Jihondong-ya, in Edo City, which is a number that's actually bigger than the number of bookstores that we have in Tucson, Arizona. So you can see how the demand for books was great at that time. From all these books, one thing that we can do is to compare books from different time periods, and especially through observing the details in the printing style, such as font choices, layout, and even the size of the books, we can tell how books transformed throughout the Tokugawa period. So for example, on this slide, we can see a picture of a manuscript produced during the Muromachi period, which is right before the Tokugawa period. Even though it's quite unrecognizable right now, we can kind of tell that this older manuscript had a more sophisticated calligraphy style, whereas the Tokugawa print on the right uses a simpler font choice, and they use characters that's more easily recognizable by the lesser educated population at the time. We can also see, for example, in these examples, the incorporation of illustrations, and even though we can't really read it, the image on the left uses very simple and colloquial language that's tailored more to an average audience. And we also see a kind of a result of the expansion of education. So on this picture on the right, we see, I can't really zoom in now, but we see these little characters right next to the kanji characters. They are glossaries for kanji, so that even if you didn't know how to read the kanji, the glossary would kind of tell you how to do it. So if we have our Japanese learners here might know how difficult it may be to read kanji sometimes, and looks like Tokugawa people struggled about the same thing. So these are the transformation that we see that shows how books were more tailored to a common and average audience. We also see, even though not really from these pictures, the size of books were getting smaller and smaller because it would be easier to fit in a pocket-sized book in your pocket that you can bring around to read for leisure. We also see how from these books, how literacy was increasing. So for example, we see textbooks for teaching reading and writing, for teaching the basic kanji and basic calligraphy styles for not only children, but also social groups like peasants and merchants. So this was educational books, right? Was just one of the purposes of books. When we talk about books nowadays, we use books for various purposes, not only for education. And it was quite similar in the Tokugawa period. Books were created for the purpose of education, for entertainment, and for practical knowledge. So just some examples of books for education. When a lot of the times when we see these museum items of Tokugawa rare books, a lot of them are from poetry, the poetry genre. So we would have books particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, designed particularly to educate and to spread about poetry. We would have haikai poetry, which is our common 5-7-5 syllable verses. And we would have waka poetry, which is a bit longer. So we have 5-7-5. Yes, 5-7-5-7-7. A bit longer and a bit more sophisticated in the words that they choose. And we have Hyakuni Ishu, which is a more playful form of poetry. Then we would also have tales, but these tales, for the educational purposes, these tales are more about the classical tales, such as the tale of Genji, the tale of Ise, or tales created in the 14th period about the wars, such as the tale of Heike. These were even considered classics back in the Tokugawa period, and there is a sort of distinguish between these tales and the tales like ghost tales that we would talk about later. There were also a lot of, Chinese classics circulating around. So in the Tokugawa period, actually throughout the 17th to 19th century, there was a sort of hierarchy of knowledge which considered anything Chinese to be superior, because at that time, China was considered by Japan as a more advanced country. So Chinese classics were a very important part for the education of aristocrats and samurai, or whoever wanted to be a important member of the ruling society. So we have Chinese classics on, say, philosophy, history, Chinese poetry, and also about Chinese medicine. But also we see influences from not just China, but from European countries, such as Netherlands. And most of the influences from Netherlands are reflected in books about technology and medicine. Autonomy, for example, the picture on the right, this was printed and published in the 18th century. As early as that, there were already this circulation of knowledge between Japan and European countries. But as we said, there were also a lot of books created for entertainment because, well, just like how we enjoy books nowadays, we don't always read for knowledge. And that's what Tokugawa period people did too. There were so many different forms of books for entertainment, but we will only cover several today. So one of the most popular genres was kibyoshi, or yellow covers. As you can see from the image, they often feature large portions of illustration, and these illustrations are quite often humorous or satirical. They also use narrative that adopt very colloquial language so that even less educated readers can understand them. And they were called kibyoshi because they literally had yellow covers. So kibyoshi is sometimes considered by modern day people as the early modern precedent of manga. People consider them the ancestor of modern day manga. But as scholars would also argue, there are very important differences in the ways that images and narratives were used. So academically, we don't really consider kibyoshi the modern version, the pre-modern version of manga, but they're still very important sources for telling us what people enjoyed at the time. So kibyoshi was particularly popular around the late 18th century. But towards 19th century, they became gradually replaced by a new genre called ninjobon, or sentimental novels. And as you can tell from the genre name, they are quite sentimental. So they feature less illustrations. They don't care so much about colloquial language. It wasn't the point, but they did feature a lot of the soap drama type plots. So we see young couples, young lovers going through a lot of obstacles, but they eventually end up living happily together. And these books were kind of supposed to bring out empathy in the readers, so they make you cry throughout the entire book, or books, multiple volumes, but in the end, they make you feel happy. So that's one of the reasons they were particularly popular. Around the same time of Ninjobon, we also have the rise of Gokan, or compiled volumes. These are kind of similar to Kibyoshi in that they feature a lot of images, illustrations, and they use way less kanji than Ninjobon works. And as you can see on the left side, they would invite famous ukiyo-e painters, ukiyo-e artists, to create very colorful covers to attract readers. And they're called gokan, they're called compiled volumes because they had so many volumes. So typically, gokan works would have between 60 to 90 volumes for one title, but occasionally we have some more extreme ones that would go up to 130 volumes. These compiled volumes, and along with Ninjobon, which also had multiple volumes like 30 to 40, they mainly circulated through lending libraries. So lending libraries were able to lend them out one volume by one volume as the author creates them. So as the author writes, say, the next volume, the lending libraries would be able to tell them, oh, hey, the readers really didn't want this character to die, so that the author would adjust perhaps the plots in the next volume. So Gokan and Ninjobon are some of my favorite genres in Tokugawa period popular literature. We also see the rise of books that are targeted at certain social groups. So for example, we have xiaolebon, or witty books, that lasted until the early 19th century, actually probably the mid 19th century. These are books that feature the pleasure quarters of Yoshiwara. So there would be a lot of illustrations and descriptions, introduction of the ladies in Yoshiwara. And the more useful part of it, or I guess the more the reason that they were so popular among upper middle class young men at the time was that they taught you how to go around in Yoshiwara. So they would teach you, these xiaolebon books would teach you, say, how to wear your hair, what fancy kimono patterns to wear, or what jokes you should be telling when you're around Yoshiwara. So these lasted quite a while until Yoshiwara, or the pleasure quarters, became a kind of abolished by the Meiji government in modern Japan. So these are mostly books for entertainment, but there were also lots, or way more, books that were created for practical knowledge. One of my favorite is Banzuke rankings. So these are one-page pamphlets that rank practically everything. And they were popular from the mid-19th century until the 20th century. We can even see replications of them nowadays that adopt the same style. So Banzuke ranking originally were rankings for sumo wrestlers. After each game, you would have these booklenders, or even just traveling merchants, selling these pamphlets, telling you about the results of the games. But then the sumo rankings became adopted to indicate the rankings of different various other things. So we would have rankings for restaurants, for example, hot springs, different brands of goods, different brands of sake, for example, brands of soap. We even had rankings of the ladies in Yoshiwara, which is a pretty not politically correct thing to do. We would also have Banzuke rankings for souvenirs from different touristy spots. These are very fun to read, and they tell you a lot about how people perceived different things and even different regions at the time. There were also a lot of circulation of setsuyoshu, which are dictionaries. Setsuyoshu actually dates back to the 14th century, where they were used mainly for linguistic purposes as dictionaries, like how we would use a Merriam-Webster dictionary nowadays. But in the Tokugawa period, they became used to refer as references for various daily topics. So in the first one, for example, we see a dictionary of the names and usages of everyday objects. Some of them would even nicely tell you how this object, the history of this object. We would also have dictionaries for, say, famous kabuki actors and also where they lived, which is a bit creepy. We also had dictionaries for foreign languages, especially at this time, dictionaries for colloquial Chinese, because colloquial Chinese language was widely used or borrowed in novels at the time. Similarly, we have meishou-zue, which are gazetteers. These gazetteers, they feature famous touristy spots, and what's special about them is that they are very detailed with illustration, and not only that, they're very detailed with the description of the place, the description of its neighborhood, very detailed descriptions of its background story, its history, and they tell you about the souvenirs that you can get from these places. So one theory is that by reading these gazetteers, those people who could not travel easily can sort of travel vicariously through reading these gazetteers, right? It's almost as if you are in the place yourself by reading these very detailed descriptions. So my favorite type of materials of practical knowledge is oraimono or letter templates. For our Japanese learners, again, if you have written an email in Japanese or a letter, a postcard in Japanese, you might know the struggle of choosing the language for seasonal greetings or choosing the proper polite language to use. And this is why Edo period people created these letter templates for the average audience so that they don't really have to learn keigo systematically to be able to write letters. And these letter templates, at first, they only covered the very basics of letters, but gradually they became to cover other subjects like invitations. And these really covered every aspect of invitation that we could think of nowadays. We had invitations to weddings, to funerals, to baby showers, or even resignation letters. And they would even give you choices of different fonts of calligraphy to choose from and what nice words to use depending on the type of the letter. So these are very fun to read through. Along a similar line, there were also a lot of guidebooks or tebiki. So Japanese learners would be familiar with the struggles of conjugating verbs. And it looks like Tokugawa period people had the same struggle because they created these guidebooks for conjugating verbs. So no worries, if you have trouble conjugating verbs, perhaps we can learn to read these types of guidebooks and eventually you will be able to conjugate as Tokugawa period people did. There were also tebiki for medicine, for everyday use. So introductions of these medicine and detailed instructions of how to use them for, say, headaches or stomach aches. And tebiki for flower arrangement or even math. So these books kind of show us that Tokugawa period people used books to transfer and to share these practical knowledge that cover pretty much every aspect of everyday life. And because of the time limit, there are other types that I could not have covered. So we had books like self-help or cookbooks, pretty much anything that we can find nowadays in a Barnes and Noble, you could find in a Tokugawa period bookstore as well. And there are more elements in Tokugawa books that we might not even anticipate. So for example, this is a page from a Ninjobon sentimental novel. And on this page, we see advertisements for medicine and advertisements for forthcoming titles from the same publisher. In a more extreme example, we see, this is also a Ninjobon work, we see an entire page of advertisements for cosmetics because this publisher, Tamaya, owned another business of selling everyday goods. And actually, Tamaya nowadays is one of the largest Japanese department stores, selling very expensive goods. So they were not, we might not anticipate seeing these, what we might consider modern elements in these Tokugawa period books. But as these examples that we have seen tell us, books were not only an essential part of everyday life, but they were enjoyed for knowledge, for entertainment. They were used for practical purposes by people from various social groups. So why do we still have this impression of rare books being preserved in museums? So briefly, very briefly on the relationship of rare books and material culture. One of the questions that I think we should always be thinking when we see these materials, when we use these materials and we're learning or researching is that, should we see them as rare materials or everyday objects? And why do these books matter? Why are we talking about them? How can these books inform our understanding of history and culture? And I guess one of the closest concern to us is that, how can we use them in our learning and researching? So I would like to use my own research as an example of using rare materials or using early modern materials as primary sources in history and literary studies. My own research, a part of my own research, focuses on shogakai, a kind of celebrity artist banquet that was highly popular in the late 18th to early 20th century. They were one of the most popular forms of socialization for intellectuals, and a very important platform for communication among popular culture producers and their audience. So during a banquet, we would have local masters of all sorts of literature, of arts. So we would have popular writers, we would have poets, painters, masters of flower arrangement and tea ceremony, who all gathered together to share objects, to display valuable objects, and to auction their works. There are the main type of materials that I use are proceedings of shogakai banquets. They are either written or printed. There weren't that many of this detailed kinds left, but for example, this particular one, we can see information about the items, the art and let's see, painting works that were on display, that were auctioned. We can also see in the middle the price of an entrance ticket to these banquets, so that it would kind of tell us what kind of people would have been able to afford a ticket to join this banquet. And on the left, we have the name of the host, the location of this banquet, and sometimes they also list participants of these banquets. There were various kinds of these proceedings or materials that's not directly proceedings, but are more like imaginations from people at that time that portray what happened or what may have happened during these banquets. And I use them not as documentation of what actually happened or who were participating in these banquets, what they were doing, but more as historical interpretation from the time to tell how people talked about these banquets and how people at the time whether they were involved or not in the banquets, how they understood these banquets. So that's one way to use primary sources. But as you may have noticed, in all these materials that we have seen, they were written in a quite different style than the modern Japanese we're used to now. So where to begin? How do we learn to use rare books as primary sources? Well, one of the essential skills you will need is pre-modern Japanese paleography. So paleography refers to the ancient writing system. In the case of Japan, it refers to the writing system used before the 1900s, which mostly consists of kuzishiji and hentaigana. So as you can see on this image, we have kuzishiji, which are cursive characters. Sometimes they're simplified, sometimes they're not. We also have hentaigana, which are variant kana, variant ways to write hiragana characters. So hiragana was used more as a sound rather than, I guess, oh, sorry, let me go back one. Hentaigana uses different kanji to represent the same hiragana. So now we would have, in modern Japanese, we have 51 hiragana, but in the Tokugawa period or even the Han pre-modern period, there were multiple kanji to represent one hiragana, and they were all called, they were all the variants of that kana. This seems very difficult, but we have several ways to tackle paleography. So we have these charts that compare different ways of writing hentaigana. They also show you common characters that were reused. We have dictionaries, 1,000-page dictionaries to show you various ways to cursify a kanji or a kana. Or if you don't want to use a dictionary, nowadays we have apps that you can use on your phone or your tablets to rely on AI to help you translate these, transcribe these pre-modern materials. But back to the question that I posed in the beginning, what makes books rare? As we can see, these books were not particularly rare. A lot of them were not that rare for people who read and used them. So something to note about the value of objects is that who needed these materials, who were using them, who were producing them. And I guess if we wanted to really go into depth about demand and the needs, who created the demand for these objects so that they could be sold at a certain price? So when we talk about books in pre-modern times or early modern times, it is very important to consider the context, the historical, economic, and social context. In what environment were these books produced? Who were reading them? Who were producing them? And I guess another question would be, why did people want to read these books? And why do we need to learn about the ways that people read them? So if anyone's interested, these are questions, important philosophical questions posed by these French philosophers, Bourdieu and Baudrillard, that talk about what makes things rare or what gives value to things. And if you're interested in learning more about books in early modern Japan, here are some recommended readings. And with that, I shall take some questions and comments if you have, or if I have actually some examples of rare books, materials from the Tokugawa period, and we could talk about it later. But thank you so much for indulging me, and yes, thank you. And let me know if you have any questions or comments. I shall stop sharing.
If you have a question, please come up to the camera. Great question. The reason. So each bird, how expensive to rent or buy in the current, Japanese yen? Like each rare bird, like, sometimes people renting, I guess. How, like,
I'm sorry.
but sometimes
can't
like, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Hi. So when nowadays, nobody rent a book anymore, but back in probably 10 years ago, people may rent a book or comics in style, but there was a rental bookstore, maybe 100 yen, $1 each week or something. But how much does it cost when, people rent back in any period? Is that reasonable price or?
Great question and very practical question. So it actually depended on the type of materials. Peter Konieczny did a really great study on this. So the books, let's say that the kind of books that the author or the publisher would want you to read, would want more people to read. So the ones like sentimental novels or compiled volumes, the books that the authors want to keep you hooked, those were very, very reasonable. Those were very cheap, actually. But they were also very expensive books, and those were more about knowledge. Let's say not your everyday practical knowledge, but more of sophisticated knowledge, say flower arrangement or serious poetry books. Those would be a bit more expensive.
Is there any receipt or anything exists, how long a certain person lending such whatever books?
Yes, actually, there are records of those. Some lending libraries would keep a record of who borrowed what. They kept very detailed records of who living where with their address on it, borrowed what title at what day of the year. And typically, because these library have to travel, the cycle of exchange would be around 1 month to 3 months.
Do you have any questions? I have a couple more questions, if you don't mind. And please feel free to go.
Yeah, if people feel comfortable to use this one to ask questions. And there are people online too,
Oh.
in the chat room.
Yes. I need to- In the chat room, if there anybody have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands. And I think Jingyi, you can. I think.
Okay.
You can manage it.
I think Elizabeth had a question. I don't think I can unmute you.
No, I just thank you for your talk. I just put in my question in the chat. I wasn't sure how to do this. I think this was really great. Were there writers who were ever the ones who were carrying all the books that they would loan? Were they like loaning their own books and then asking the readers what they wanted someone to write?
Yes, great question. So one of the examples that I showed of the sentimental novels, Ninjōbon, the author, at first he was he was a publisher. He printed his own books, and occasionally he actually had a bookstore, physical bookstore, where he would sell his works or rent his works out, where he could collect also information from his readers. And that's partly why he was such a successful popular writer, because he had that firsthand knowledge from his readers, and which is also why some other popular writers hated him, because he had the resources to print his own books and collect all that information. So at the time, there was very contradicted reputation about him. Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have a quick question. Oh, can you hear me?
I can't quite hear.
Okay, good.
Well, now I'm hearing both. Sorry, I'm hearing both.
Okay, just a second. I need to mute.
Okay, better? Still echo. Okay, I'm
You can
going
just
to
walk over there.
question. All right, I guess my quick question is more from the perspective of the readers. So when the readers got the books, do you think they will also like to write notes or commentary, like notes on the books? If they do write commentary on the books, will their notes or commentary components be further kind of reprinted and circulated? I guess my question is, in short, is there commentary practices also happening during that particular period of time in Japan?
That is such a wonderful question. I can see an MA thesis coming out of this. So that depends also on the type of books that you're reading, right? If you are borrowing a book from a lending library, they do not actually allow you to write anything on it. Otherwise, you would get a fine. So there were actually records of readers getting a fine for doodling on the pages. But if it were say books about Chinese classics or poetry or flower arrangement that were circulated among a certain group of people. So for example, we could have a group of masters, learners, of practitioners of flower arrangement, and the master just published a book and we're circulating this book to learn from it. Yes, people would write commentaries in it, people would write annotations of it, and if these were good annotations and commentaries, someone else would take these and make it like a annotated version of the book and publish that as an independent book. So we see a lot of examples of, especially with these classical knowledge, such as Tale of Ise, Tale of Genji, or Chinese poetry. There were lots of annotated works published from these notes. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, thank you.
Awesome.
Can I ask a question completely relevant? Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah.
Can I ask some question about Japanese literature, which is not really about today's lecture?
Sorry, I couldn't.
About the concept that you mentioned in the lecture, like a term in Japanese literature.
A term in
Japanese literature.
Japanese literature?
Yeah. So what is the relationship between waka and hyakunin issue?
Awesome question. Okay, the short version is hyakunin isshu is technically a subgenre of waka, because what hyakunin isshu did was they took the most representative works from 100 people, not really 100 sometimes, and compiled them as hyakunin isshu to use as the most, I guess, classical poetry for educational purposes. But that was only in the original stage. They gradually transformed into hyakunin isshu of anything, basically, especially in the Tokugawa period, when books for entertainment were created at such a high rate. We had hyakunin isshu for daily objects. For example, we had hyakunin issue for plants, for flowers, which is kind of like a ranking of flowers, except that you make up a poem that's supposedly written by a famous poet from the 11th century. Well, they didn't really write the poem, but that poem describes that flower, for example. And we have 100 flowers as a ranking kind of thing. And not just flowers, right? There were hyakunin isshu of characters from the Tale of Genji or from the water margin. Yes.
Thank you so much. That's so weird because I actually know the Japanese plays a game called Haruta or something.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, awesome question.
Hello, I'm the Special Collections Librarian here. Thank you so much. That was a fabulous talk. And I guess I'm just totally fascinated by these walking lending libraries because I'm used to the English model where people have to travel to their library. So do we know, were those lending libraries did they just operate in very, very small territories, or did their areas overlap? And did like individual libraries specialize in different types of books, or how did the competition work basically?
Very interesting question. I love it. So yes, at first, there was a lot of overlap, which caused great problems because you would have lending libraries fighting each other. And there was actually, since the 18th century, there was this association of publishers because the same thing happened with publishers. They would fight over each other. They would try to take each other's authors if they're popular enough. So they created this association to kind of mediate everything. And that association had to also step in with the lending libraries. And I guess eventually there became this, there was this consensus that they would not actively try to take away each other's business, and they would try to diversify in the types of materials they would be lending. And one other thing they did was to expand their territory. So for example, a lending library in Edo City, they might not just stay in Edo City, they would extend to rural areas around Edo City. Some might even travel to other places like Eastern Japan, or we have extreme cases who travel from Tokyo to the Kyushu, or to the southern area. Although at that point they don't really lend books because they still have to travel to collect them. They were more selling at the time. But yes, they had divisions between different people, and depending on how high in the hierarchy of the publishing businesses you are, you might get a bigger chunk than others.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Just wanted to ask you about, I have two questions. One is about the relationship between the image and the script. Is there a correlation? Are they telling the same narrative, or are they separate texts? That's one question. Then the other question was more about how you are approaching the question of rare. Are you saying that those books are rare for us, like modern 21st century people, but in their time they were not rare? Or how are you approaching that question of what is rare? Thank you.
Great questions. So in terms of the relationship between the illustration and the narrative, again, depending on the genre, right? So for the heavily illustrated ones, such as Kibyoshi or in Gokan works, usually we see a very strong connection between the narrative and the illustrations. But the interesting thing is they might not always be on the same page. And this is more obvious with works with less illustrations, but more heavy on the prose. So we could see a picture describing the plots that happened 5 or 6 pages ago. But it didn't, I guess, you would still be able to tell that the picture is for that. But because the purpose, and that's also why Kibyoshi is not considered the present of manga, because the illustrations did not function as the assistant to tell the narrative. The illustrations were just there for kind of visual stimulation. They did not function as a part of the narrative. There would be, however, details in the illustrations that's not covered in the narrative, but those are very minor, and usually those are just thrown in there for fun. So yes, not a very strong connection. And with regards to how I view rare books, this term of rare books, I think, first of all, is, well, in this English term, right, it's, I guess I hate to say Eurocentric, but there is this conception of what we see as rare. Why are they rare, right? Rare means that they have high value, which means if we were to buy them or sell them nowadays, it will be very expensive. But in Japanese, actually, they were not referred to as rare books. They were just called wahon, or just literally Japanese books. And if we want to be more specific, kotenseki, right, classical books, but not so much as rare. So it really comes down to the question of what books in these early modern materials are considered rare. Because, okay, so for example, this is the time to show off my little collection. I have these pages from early modern books from the Tokugawa period that I bought on eBay for $5. So this two combined are $5 because they're worthless to I guess the people who are selling them. And interestingly, this would be one page from a woodblock series. And these are, I think, these are all letter templates. If I flip it this way, you might be able to see it. How to write a notification of death, things like that, or notification or invitation of wedding. They're not considered rare. They're not sold at $100 because they technically do not have value for research. But as I am using them in this lecture or in any Kuzushiji lecture we have at the university here, we use them to tell the process of, say, printing. We use them to see the different type of fonts. So I guess in a way I'm channeling the theories from Bourdieu and Baudrillard that the value of these books were really, a large part of them were added on by later people, and not only by people in Japan, but perhaps the audience in the West who saw them as not so common things, right? In the 20th century, especially when Japan opened up to the West, ukiyo-e paintings, for example, ukiyo-e printings became so expensive, and nowadays you can buy them for $500. But in the Edo period, they were used to, say, fix a hole in your door or window. The understanding of the value of these materials really depend on who we are, how we use them, and what purpose we use them from. Sorry, that was a bit long, but I hope it answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I take it back on that question that Carlo asked? Hi, I'm Lee. Fantastic talk. So I have a question about the criteria, right? So here in Chinese book culture, we have this term 善本, basically like books of high quality, translate rare book. But still, the definitions for 善本 varies depending on the criterion that people have. So I was wondering, you mentioned this term, the Japanese term wahon. So like contemporary Japanese libraries, what kind of criteria they would use when they collect wahon, right? So in other words, what's their criterion for collecting rare books in today's Japanese libraries, right? Another question related to criteria, as you mentioned, there's high literacy rate in Japan during that period, like 60%. I was wondering what kind of criteria they were using, because they're different, like the writing system of Japanese is so complicated, right? And reading in hiragana, katakana, the different kinds of literacy. So what kind of criteria they use? Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. So regarding the criteria for rare books in Japanese libraries, it depends on how available that book is right now, because so that's kind of the reason why these painting scrolls or tales from the 11th century are so expensive that some of them are deemed national treasure, because there are not so many of them left, right? Especially if they're handwritten ones, that means there's only one of them. So those are very rare. They are preserved. Those are actually the ones that are preserved in humidity and temperature controlled environments. But things like this, these mass-produced ones, mass-printed ones for purposes like, I don't know, writing letters or cooking books, they weren't, if there are many prints of them left around Japan, they are not considered like super rare. So I think that the Japanese term is kicho, valuable. They're not considered valuable. So in the Japanese libraries that I've worked in, there are categories of kicho, valuable, jun kicho, quasi valuable, and just wahahon. Those are the ones that I just put on the shelves that anyone can see. So it's quite different from the criteria here, because any Japanese books produced before the 1900 would be stored in special collections, according to my knowledge. So there's this kind of availability is definitely a difference. And regarding the criteria for literacy rate, the study was done by a professor called Richard Rubinger. And when he did the study, he separated the criteria, he separated the study subjects into several different categories. So there was one, for example, that studies how much they needed literacy to kind of live a basic social life, because say it went down to a village level, for example, these farmers, they needed to at least be able to write their own names in kanji, and they needed to be able to read their neighbors' names in kanji, and they needed to be able to read the official documents that are reworded or explained to them by their chief in the village. So in that sense, it wasn't that high, but there's also another level of how they were supposed to, for example, write these kinds of documents. Even if you have very low literacy rate, if you don't know any basics of reading or writing, it's still very hard to reproduce this. Like, we can take these to a Japanese class and have students with zero knowledge of Japanese trying to reproduce them. They won't look that good. They might be readable, but they won't look that good. So there was this minimum level of requirement for them to at least have the basic level of reading and understanding. And when it comes to the gender issue for women, for example, it's another different thing, because they were not typically required to write a lot of kanji, but they had to be able to read other say maps, or if they wanted to ninjobo novels. Studies have shown that the majority of the readers of those were women, so they were definitely able to read those. Yeah, so I guess my answer would be the criteria differs depending on what social group we're talking about and what time period we're talking about. Not a good answer, but I hope it answers a bit, at least.
Does anybody have any more questions? If not, I thank you so much, Jean.
Thank you so much all for indulging me for this past hour.